Okay, excellent. Are we ready to go then?
Sure.
If anyone has questions about the exam, extra time, that is non-English, non-native English speaking students get extra time, and people with official disabilities get extra time, and the amount depends on the letter from the officials. We have several of these letters already. Please don't just send them to me. We need to send them as it says on the syllabus at the top. Specific questions about the exam and its administration should go to the four of us, as I will not administer the exam. We need to have copies of all those documents to the three TAs, please.
Yeah, a question from Alessandra. So a very brief answer to your question. The format of the midterm is we have two parts. One is identification of some concepts, very important concept we have all learned. It's on syllabus, and professors stress those concepts over and over. Just focus on that, read the syllabus closely, and we TA would also glean from syllabus the important concepts. For example, buzz, these concepts are everywhere. And we also have an essay, and you are gonna have, you're gonna choose one of the two essays to write. So maybe we have 40% for the concept, 60% for the essay. So that's the general rule of the thumb. But we will. So if you are a student in the previous global local politics, you know the format. But if you don't know about that, that's something that my brief announcement would be a useful guide. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. That's good for all. All right. We have 5 or 6 things on the agenda for today. So I'll start with an overview of some of the readings and questions about reframing about personalism. And I'll add for Brandon, if he might want to comment briefly on alienation and Stanislavski and Brecht, Aristotle. Third, more comments specifically on the personalism and related more general concepts like buzz. Then something on North Korea as a striking example, which we started last time briefly. And then we have a couple of videos contingent on how much time we have left with Hee-Sun Chong and Jane Jacobs, but they're on the reading list and they're documents on Canvas if if you want more elaboration. Okay, we introduced the Kentuckville karaoke book last time. I want to say a few more just a couple of the big points in here, and then highlight work in progress and ways of thinking beyond this, which especially is illustrated by China, by the China stuff which we're doing, which we're weaving in here. Could we show, please, Alan, the figure on page 140? Yeah, it's a little, 140 is a little earlier than the ones I'm not sure if I included this in my list.
Is it since Tocqueville 140?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I have to move up. 140. Is this article you're looking for, or the next one, defining Bohemia?
It's called Figure 1. It's a definition. It's measures of Bohemia. That's table 1. We want Figure 1. So,
Figure 1. Okay. This is.
It's just the next page.
Next page.
Yeah. No. I'm sorry. That was it. Okay.
The 3.
Yeah. Yes. There we go. The very simple point of this is that is to, and one big theme I'm raising today is why and how is Asia different, and how can we identify specific differences in Asia, but second, not say Asia's different and we cannot compare. That is, we're trying to find dimensions of Asian societies that specifically differ, that we can compare them on to each other between Seoul, Tokyo, Taiwan, etc., but also to compare with with other cities and countries internationally. So that's illustrated in this figure. Seoul and Tokyo, Seoul especially, has they're all relatively similar in terms of some measures of bohemia at the city level, or let's say the neighborhood level, where we have the data. But what this stresses is that the differences among neighborhoods are much larger in Chicago than they are in Tokyo or Seoul. And the simple, quick answer for this, I would say, is that the concept of planning and zoning, which you have developed in Western Europe, and then more in, I shouldn't say more, less in the US than in Europe, is nevertheless much less still present in Asia generally. And I've been, that is, most discussion does not compare neighborhoods across cities and countries. And so this kind of finding, as Alan has written in his thoughtful reading, Wicker Park is the one clear arts neighborhood in Chicago, or it was the one clear arts neighborhood. It's now migrated a little elsewhere, and it's gone down in terms of the percentage of artists living there. But there's a book on it, and it's recent history and it's well documented. And the point is, just as me as a tourist visitor walking around Tokyo and Seoul, you find things together on the same street, which you do not find even in Chicago, which is a classic unplanned city. That is, Paris or Rome, or especially Paris, is the quintessential, highly planned, aesthetically informed city. Chicago is not. And so, nevertheless, Chicago is, you can see that black line to the west, upper left over there is Wicker Park, Humboldt Park, or bohemian in character. All right, the simple point I'm making is that the idea of planning has led the idea of absence of planning in Asian cities in general has led to having many things on the same street that you would not find in Chicago, or far less likely in many European cities that are more planned than Chicago. Like a school, an elementary school, a nightclub with, let's say, transgressive activities going on in the nightclub, a Baptist church holding a meeting, a prayer meeting, can be going on simultaneously with the nightclub having its patrons come in, drinking and carousing and so forth. That is, in Chicago, it is illegal to sell liquor within something like a quarter mile of a school. And so you therefore do not have a school next to a nightclub because of Americans' tradition of Puritanism that we do not want to corrupt young people. Okay, that's the idea. On the other hand, that conception of zoning and the American combination with Puritanism has led others like Jane Jacobs, or our discussions of bohemia as a driver of artistic and innovative neighborhoods, to be in conflict. That is, these are two conflicting criteria. That is, it may be that the presence of artists and bohemians may lead to more nightclubs nearby at the same time that it runs into zoning issues. Okay, so I'm framing that as a policy conflict and a normative conflict within Western, especially say American cities, which have more Puritanism in general than the European. But the articulated most forcefully by Thomas Jefferson, just to make the case clear. Thomas Jefferson and others said, America is a country of small farmers. All cities are corrupting. We therefore want to put our state universities and our state capitals in small towns far away from these corrupting big cities. Therefore, you have Urbana, you have Springfield, Illinois, you have Austin, Texas, or in smaller towns where you have big universities and sometimes state capitals as well, but they are not in Houston or Dallas or New York or Chicago. Okay, that's the simple point, which is sort of a basic taken for granted kind of aspect, which may be one factor making Asian cities and their dynamics and their countries in some ways different. Okay, so simple point. There's a section in the book, I won't go through in detail now, 136, 137, 138 of what is Bohemia. And we go through 10 dimensions, ranging from simply reacting against people nearby. And I'm bringing this in to begin to talk about personal relationships. If that is the second dimension listed here, Bohemia, is reacting against people like parents, friends, relatives who may articulate a moral or broader sense of lifestyle. Or this may be simply, do it my way because I'm your father, and the son does the opposite because he's my father and he told me to do it this way, so I rebel against him because I'm a rebellious teenage kid. Okay, so this dynamic does not mean you necessarily have green hair or that you have a different strong political agenda. It's a family-based kind of dynamic. However, one of the biggest single things differentiating Asia is stronger family. So where and how the family dynamics interpenetrate with these Bohemian elements is a critical aspect of innovation, Bohemia, and the like. So I'll leave it simply for you to glance at. And so just one last quick comment. The number 10. Some people, such as Richard Florida, have measured Bohemia by the number of artists in a neighborhood. We disagree, because you can have, even though this may be generally true in the West, the Asian case brings out more explicitly that there are lots of artists in Asia, but many of them are not Bohemians. There was a case after the Japanese problems about 10 years ago with a nuclear reactor melting down. There was one Japanese photographer who took photographs of this and the devastation that it generated around it and people suffering and so forth. And he put up some of his pictures on a website, and 90%, every other artist in Japan, not just the prime minister, the artists of Japan, almost to a person, at least almost to every person who commented on this, said, you should not have done that. You are attacking Japanese honor. This is a disrespectful action. Even if you're an artist, you should not do this because you are a bad citizen. Okay, that kind of point, Japanese scholars have commented to me when I've said, when for instance, one group of several hundred political scientists I spoke with, I met with them for 2 weeks afterward, talked about, where and how do you have individualism? several Japanese political scientists would say individualism and democracy is not an Asian concept. Traditionally, if you would have a petition which you would give to the emperor and it would be signed by all of the residents of a village, and one of the residents of the village would put it into the carriage of the emperor as he went by, that person who carried the envelope would be immediately killed. And they knew that because it was you may not ever question in any way the emperor. And so that sense that there's an authoritarian history which is still here in Japan and parts of Asia today is an aspect which we need to bring in, but not go overboard. I mean, not to say it's everywhere because it's changing, but where and how and why and how much is a tricky thing which we deal with and which we need to deal with, just as we need to deal with authoritarianism more generally in the world. And the recent so-called populist leaders, Donald Trump, others with Brexit going on in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein, Putin, etc., and where and how they are or are not legitimate and how they can maintain their legitimacy and what the role of the arts and placemaking might be is a critical issue that we're trying to address in a systematic manner. Okay, so the role of the arts in this is one thing we're looking at. And so if we go to page 195, please, this gets at the idea of what can artists add to public discussion? And public art is often explicitly politically and ideologically engaged. 190. Did I say 195? Yeah, I said yeah. It's a graphic figure.
Figure 4, or we have different page number, but
table 3.
Table 3. Okay, maybe up a little bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that we had so next time I'll try to give you a table number or something like that. Yeah, this is it. Okay, the point of this is a hypothetical. This is not actual data. This is hypothetical to illustrate how context can shift the value of different resources. So some people will say, if we try to say why do you have this in paper? So, oh, that's a rich city. My quick answer, and try to think about this if anybody says that or you think this, money does not talk. Money does not say what the money should be used for. Money is a resource. But economists can talk about a resource constraint, that it constrains what you can do. But separate from money is preferences. So what people want is not defined by their money. It's defined by what they want is defined by preferences or values or goals. So for instance, that you want to be more or less puritanical, or you want more or less zoning, those are goals. But having more or less money is a means by which you could implement that. But money per se doesn't tell you how much, how that is. So the way we illustrate this is in terms of resources and how different kinds of resources have different value in different ideal types of political systems. And so across the top, we have business dominant, politically dominant, egalitarian, culturally dominant, residential. Okay, so money should be more important in this simple case in a business dominant city like a classic, say, Texas city. Houston, Dallas are seen as cities where money is more visibly dominant in terms of business legitimacy. By contrast, a residential neighborhood, this should be low. And in an arts or bohemian neighborhood like Greenwich Village or Wicker Park, people are less likely to respect and to listen to someone who is a multimillionaire simply because he has a lot of money. Okay, That's the idea, that the value of different resources changes depending on the local context, which can be a country, a city, or a neighborhood. So by contrast, votes are more, let's say, are medium important in all of these others, whereas in the business dominant, votes are less important. Political leader access, but then the main one to stress here, at the other extreme, is aesthetic buzz. And this should be more important, or most important, in a culturally dominant place like, say, Wicker Park or Greenwich Village, the Latin Quarter in Paris. By contrast, the aesthetic buzz should be least important in a business dominant or political party dominated kind of context, or just a strong residential area. Okay, so that's at least, these are hypotheses, you could say. These are not findings, these are hypotheses which we can test in different neighborhoods around the world. But they suggest that we should not just say arts are becoming dominant everywhere, even if the arts are becoming generally more important. Where and why is likely to vary with the specific surroundings as hypothesized here. And more okay, and let me just mention we have a number of economists in the class. We'll come back to the idea then of efficient markets. What this is showing is this makes the point that markets are not equally efficient. This is showing that the concept, say, of transaction prices are higher in some places where the conversion value or the conversion costs are higher or lower. Okay, that's the quick idea. Can we flip then, please, to and so what I'm featuring here is just a small number of big points about how the arts and buzz work. Over on page 274, please. This is figure 2 near the
that's the last paper, right?
Yeah, last paper of the book. This will simply give you a set of variables, and what this does, this is the most analytically complicated chapter. So read it a little more slowly, and what I'm featuring here is that perfect. This is it. Is just to say these are the variables that we want to pay attention to. And even if that is, think about these as informing some of our discussions. And the reason I'm saying this is that, and putting them in a list and featuring them here today, is that these lists are longer than what you normally see. And so if we label these, and this came in this, the finding that just reiterate very briefly again. Seoko Kim did a PhD here in sociology. He analyzed the GSS, ISSP, the international data on citizens, national samples of citizens. And the core idea was, does Tocqueville work? And the striking, interesting finding that led to the book was, no, not everywhere. And he found it in his native Korea, that the more that Korean citizens participated had no impact on their trust. However, he measured trust by omitting, this is the entree to a big point we want to talk about more today. He omitted in doing that personal trust in people you know, like your neighbors and family. He focused only on trust on the bigger, more abstract institutions like the police, the national government, the press, and he then added them up and got a measure of trust, which he used in all the countries. So he then repeated this all around the world, and the striking finding was that this was true in Korea, in Portugal, in Brazil, Russia, and China. This was not true in Western Europe, the US, or other places. So what this in turn, when we had that finding, and that's in the early part of the book, now, and this at the end of the book, after we knew about that finding for several years, I then wrote this chapter with 2 people from Portugal, and I deliberately wanted to engage them because Portugal was one of the lead Western countries which was like Korea, and the Tocqueville failed. The Tocqueville hypothesis did not hold. So what Felipe Silva suggested was, let's not just look at the narrow definition of trust as measured that way. Let's look at multiple other dimensions of what we can call democratic processes, including, most of all, the first, protest. You can have burning of cars. You can have breaking of windows. You can have demonstrations, peaceful and violent. And where and how these are working, if you don't kill the prime minister, you can still have trust. And we're having and these are gray areas for democracy, because these are not peaceful voting kinds of things. So the most recent case is Hong Kong, the protests in Hong Kong going on. But I would say what's striking to me is that the national government did not crack down in the first day or the first week or after the first months, even though this has potential major implications for the rest of China. So the fact, I would say that's a sign that the national government in China, despite the Western press coverage, is more tolerant of and more confident enough to permit the protests to go on in Hong Kong without just sending in the police. In 1968, when we had protests all over the US, in all the different, we had hundreds and hundreds, thousands of protests going on, African American students, anti-Vietnam demonstrators, or all three of those combined. And in most cases, the police sent in after a day. For instance, if the students would occupy an administration building, the president of the university, the trustees would call in the police and drag the students out immediately. The University of Chicago was the major exception in the entire United States, and in many respects, the world, in that we let the students occupy the administration building until they left. My sister was a first-year college student at that time, so I got sort of daily reports on what was happening, and so this was 1969, so the simple point I'm making is that how you frame protest is especially sensitive, and many people would say, especially if it's violent, it should not be considered democratic at all. That should be illegitimate. So we're including this in part because of our Portuguese, who said, the part of the Latin tradition is to have street protests, not voting, not just voting, but protest in the streets. So we've included those and measured these in various ways. Okay, social trust I'm measuring. I'm mentioning here as something that can be either persons personally, or it can be more abstract relations like trust in political institutions. It can be duty. It can include. I'm a patriotic North Korean or Italian, and therefore I will not protest, or I will engage in pageantry or a march or parade. By contrast, say in southern Italy, my conception of art is Jesus and the Madonna in a church. That is art, and that is part of Roman Catholicism, and that's a 500-year-old central conception of art in the West. And in that sense, it was consciously created to legitimate the Roman Catholic Church. And the church was the main patron of most of the arts, architecture, beautiful cathedrals, the Vatican, Rome. All of these things were consciously and explicitly built, or the Notre Dame in Paris. Citizens built that and were engaged in ways that were strongly identified or discussed as showing their strong Christianity. Okay, so it was an explicit ideological religious commitment from the beginning. Okay, so I'm going through simply to make the point that all of these can be included in various democratic processes, although some are controversial and others may be less so. Okay, then the background is can we stay there with the figure? Okay, the normal things which the main research, Putnam, Sidney Verba, citizen participation measures include sex, age, education, income, liberal, conservative, left, right scale. Then social participation may be of four kinds: local community, religious participation, cultural activities, and professional associations. Then what we see at the bottom is the idea, these are not causal arrows, these are interaction. These are heightening or suppression arrows with a circle around them, which suggests that these are not the causes, these are things which heighten or suppress the importance of these other dynamics. And so we use culture in 7 different, or we measure culture in this chapter in 7 different ways, which are illustrated by the things below here. So one simple finding, if we go to some findings, we don't want to get in fancy details, but if we go to 282, 283, this is a table in figures, please. This shows one of lots, one of lots of tables that we have like this, and it shows how important are the arts, sort of the 7th or 8th item down there. Arts measured by this is a measure of the proportion of artists in the entire labor force. And if we have more artists in the labor force, what this shows is we have more protest. So across the top, we have these different kinds of democratic participation. Number 1 is protest. Number 2 is trust. Trust is not higher if you have artists. Social trust is not higher, that is, they're not significant. We see 3 stars on the far left. The others with no stars are not statistically significant. They're basically 0. And so the other classic thing, which is often important to pay attention to here, is education. So educational level is the strongest coefficient here in general in terms of, that is let me start with the heading: multi-level regression analysis, predictors of democratic politics. Within, this is only those cases where this is a new political culture context. So these are people who say, they may be in any country of the world, but they say, I am more socially liberal, I'm more fiscally conservative, I'm in favor of active citizen participation. That is, we create an index of this kind of culture. But then we don't say you only find, this is not a national country variable. This is an individual citizen variable, and then we aggregate up and analyze it here. Okay, so basically what this is showing is that the individual respondent's educational level is the number 1 factor leading to protest. More educated people or say that protest is a legitimate activity for democratic participation. Okay, so those are the quick findings about how artists, that is, how do the arts play here? And what this shows is there is a positive relationship. It's significant. On the other hand, can we scroll down? Do we have, no, in the table still. I want to point out how strong is is all of this. And
the same table or the next different another context?
Yeah, I will skip it because it it doesn't come out so clearly. That is the variance component level 2, cultural trade. That is, there are 2 kinds of regressions to simplify. Ordinary least squares, which gives you, or no, here it is. You see here, here's the adjusted R square. The general point of these is that all 4 of these political cultures, if we break up all of our respondents in terms of these 4 types, within each of the 4, we only have an adjusted R square of 0.75, 10. This is showing you that in the first, we're explaining 7% of the variance. In the second, 10%. In the third, 2%. In the fourth, less than 1%. So that is, the strength of these models is, as I've said, relatively low. But these are normal for most of life. most of life is not determined by these things which you hear in the media every day. You know, rich people do this, poor people do that. Not true. Their income does not explain very much in many cases. Okay, so I'm featuring that simply to show you to look for the adjusted R-square when you see results. And then I'm pointing out that within this new political culture context, citizen participation is especially through protest. And that's different from, that is the arts impact is especially through protest. Whereas if we go over to, well, no, it's not significant, but I'm just illustrating the idea. The Southern Italian traditional Catholic image of art is not protest. It is to enhance the feelings of duty and respect to the Roman Catholic Church, to Christ, to Mary, and the arts is used in that way. It is not bohemian at all. It's the opposite of bohemian, as we saw in Goth Girl. Okay, and Baudelaire. All right, those are the main points I wanted to make. I wanted to make directly from those pages. Let me stop if we have questions or comments on any of those. I'm trying deliberately, as we've said, this course is aimed to be with clear enough that every first-year college student can understand everything. You don't need to understand how these statistics are created. But the idea, the general idea, is what I'm showing you here. And you've got markings by I'm applauding Alan, which shows he has read this very carefully. He's marked it up and he's thought this stuff through, which is great. And so he's pointing out big things to pay attention to. Any questions, comments? I'm building, so I'm building to get more interrelated things. Okay, let me do the same thing briefly for a couple of the.
We have a question from Santiago.
Okay, go ahead, Santiago.
Hi. Yeah, I just had a question because like around the definition of art, like do we consider different types of art, or do you consider in that book different types of art, like art engaged for like feminism, for example, or art engaged for religious causes?
Yeah.
Or do you have like a main like a standard definition of?
Two answers to that. It depends on the data source. That is, if we are doing field work, if we're doing photographs of a neighborhood, if we're reading texts, we can define it in whatever, and we would be synthesizing studies which have done many things like this with many different sorts of methods. So anything that previous analysts have used, we're happy to at least build on and see how they define art. And it's an important question because artists are now doing things like taking photographs of average people in a city street, and then they post, or then they make hundreds of these. And so having used Santiago as a Parisian, part-time Parisian, Paris is covered with stuff like this. I mean, they're big official governmental buildings, which are now covered with things like this in ways that transform explicitly what the Ministry of Culture calls the patrimony into creative, contemporary, anti-traditional art. And the Ministry of Culture is letting that pass. I mean, they're saying, we want to do both, even in the Ministry of Culture. So at Christmas time, they wrap Christmas tree decorations around the ministry buildings in ways that say, this is just a Christmas tree. You can play with our building the way you do with a Christmas tree and put on crazy things, even if they're not really very good art, but they're public art in that sense. By contrast, so that's approach one. Approach two is, how do we compare these things internationally and across neighborhoods and cities? And at least in the tables we're showing here, artist means simply whatever the local census measures. And this is a percentage of people who in the census in Korea or in France or the US say, I am an artist and I work, and then there's a follow-up question, what type? And so we have 72 types of artists in the US Census: painter, sculptor, et cetera, et cetera. And so the measure there is, but however, you can only choose one. So if you say my main job, and they may think in terms of money, I may earn most of my money as a taxi driver or a waiter, they may put down waiter or taxi driver, but in fact, in his heart of hearts, she or she may be an artist first and foremost, but they're not able to support themselves financially by selling their artwork. So in that sense, this is a measurement problem for artists, and there's not a right or wrong answer. That is, in general, you have the issue, if you want to compare things, you have to often use different definitions than you might use if you were doing another kind of study. So thank you for bringing that out explicitly. Okay, any other question like that? All right, let me push on with just a couple of big findings from the chapter of scenescapes, which Alan has prepared, and starts with a Paris example of occupying, really that is, this was threatened gentrification in Paris, that a quote illegally occupied big building, an empty building occupied by artists, was taken over and occupied for years. And when the government was about, when the government was about to tear this down, there were so many protests from the artists that the fridge, they did not tear it down, and they kept this for artists. Okay, so as we push on in this chapter, one question, it's 3 or 4, these are big questions about the arts. And so one thing that we've already covered in several readings is the table. We just went by there quickly, that if you look at civic groups, artists are dramatically increasing. That's a big background question, especially for the Kentuckyville karaoke book, but it's also right here, the same thing. The Netherlands is #1. The change in the number of artists in civic organizations is hugely increased in the Netherlands. US is very high, Sweden is pretty high, so these are high here. If we go on down, do we see here China? Do we have, yeah, so Russia and China are slightly negative. That is, arts civic organizations are not increasing in these negative countries at the bottom. Okay, so there are differences. So why some of these differences, and what are their meanings? Okay, so let's push on, and we have then on page 2. Yeah, this may not be so easy. Page 255 in my copy, we have about 10 propositions. So these are guiding hypotheses about the arts and politics, and where and why do we have arts playing a political role. And we're bringing in things like public art, that public artists may feature often egalitarianism in ways that people who paint the Mona Lisa did not. There was a cartoon recently that the Mona Lisa was looking down to the floor, and on the back of her head there were some white hairs that were growing out because of the pandemic, showing an egalitarian transformation of the Mona Lisa in a contemporary world of egalitarianism. Okay, so we have hypotheses about the #1 focuses on the idea of egalitarianism may be shared with anti-corporatism across multiple scenes, and when they are more shared, they're more likely to grow into broader social movements. Conversely, individual self-expression may stress uniqueness and discourage engagement with collective political issues. Scenes that stress creative individuality can thus conflict with the political logic of compromise and joining of others on common issues. Okay, so these are examples of the kinds of hypotheses that we're thinking about, some of which are clearly tested, and others we don't have the data to test them here in this chapter, and we say that explicitly. These are things we all ought to think about, even if these are hard to test or assess. They're important to think about. Okay, then if we go on over to figure 6.3, it's roughly 248, page 248 in the printed copy. This shows, just to show you the kinds of variables.
Figure
6.3. It has circles. It's regressions.
Oh,
with
okay.
yeah. That's it. Okay. So what this shows is what kinds of zip codes have any new social movements or more, or if you have one, why do you? That is, we do this separately because the data are highly skewed. That is, most places, most zip codes have no social movements. Desert areas, very small rural towns, little places in Texas or rural Kansas, whatever, they do not have a human rights organization listed at a street address. Okay, so they have a 0. So we have so many of these amenities data are skewed, and we have to consciously deal with that. But the skewness is an important part of the study, and the story, namely that places like Washington and New York have got massive numbers of these things because they're capital headquarters and so forth. And so population density, big cities, or let's say county area. No, actually, population size is insignificant. Its density is more of a driver here. And then, of course, as expected, higher education leads to in terms of the right-hand column, if you have more highly educated people, you have more new social movements. And so education is a big driver. Cultural employment, this is a measure of the arts. So more arts activities and employing more people, you have more new social movements. Urbanity, a cultural dimension, one of our scenes dimensions. It's a summary of all the 15 scenes dimensions in terms of things like transgression, glamour, and so forth at the high end, and localism, neighborliness at the low end. And so everybody sort of has said things like this before. What's new and what we've almost never found before is the last variable. The more people who walk to work is almost as important as education and rent and these other things. That was dramatic. We'd never seen that before. This leads us to the idea of the neighborhood, and placemaking with neighborhood specificity can have a big impact, or let's say it's strongly interrelated with one of our main measures here. That is the dependent variable is social service organizations, environmental organizations, and human rights organizations. All right. Walking to work is probably most affected by is probably most related to environmental organizations. So if you walk by lots of garbage and then you see, say, across the street, you see some people are in another neighborhood, you see environmental activists there, you may be inspired to participate more in an environmental organization. And so walkability here should increase. Walkability is sort of density kinds of measures in contrast to actual walking. Walking is the census measure of people actually walking to work. Walkability is density kinds of geography, physical measures which heighten and facilitate walking. Okay, so walking is the new general idea which we found, and nobody, we were amazed at how strong it was. Okay, just one or two more findings, then we'll go on to more general stuff.
So you had a question.
Question, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering why the effects of different independent variables they can compare with each other, because I thought there would be like some different degrees of causal relationship, and then they can be compared with each other.
Excellent point. Yes, I mean, what the point you're making matches with those plus and minus signs, which I showed, such as business, business location, a business dominant town in the other book, or an arts neighborhood like Wicker Park. So yes, you're right. These are national data, in this case for the US only. And if we broke this down and created the kinds of measures we had in the other book, and we had, say, arts neighborhoods, then we should get different coefficients for each of these. So yes, I mean, I would agree. We simply don't do that level of detailed neighborhood analysis here. This is just the national average. So yes, that's important to as a qualification, that all of these all these kinds of individual coefficients can shift depending on what else is in the neighborhood. And so that's, and so you don't need to, it's not just a question of data and statistics. First and most important is to have this in your head as an analyst. So your question is great. And so that's a qualification that holds if you read a table or you're thinking yourself, how can I analyze these data? And it's a limitation of national data. And one answer to that is if you've only got national, if you want the questions of citizens, we usually need to use national sample surveys because you only got 1,500 people in a country. You can't do it at a neighborhood level for that reason. The N's not big enough. But what we can do is bring in neighborhood characteristics and thus measure the number of artists in the neighborhood and the like. So what we do in this table is to try to join, that is, we'd like to have individual voting by every single citizen, and then measure what they said. I shouldn't say, that would be, I shouldn't say that better. We don't want to, we want to do both is my general point, or 2 or 3 ways of it. There are multiple ways of analyzing these things and to make you conscious that these are analytical big decisions, and we get different results depending on how we do it. And here, what we see, the drama of this finding is in 1996, fairly recently, 5 elections ago, presidential elections, and I'm using this one because this is in the book, Scenescapes. But if we update this as we've done in a paper on Trump, the Trump election for 2016 is the same as this, it just continues it a little further. That is, there wasn't a big change in the Trump election, despite what you would think in the, yeah, okay, so you're looking, this is a paper we have, I guess this is, okay, it's a paper which we're referring to in which where we're applying these scenes ideas to the Trump election and participating in international conferences on this in other countries. So there's a table sort of like this. Maybe it's not close enough to compare, but the simple point is this pattern that is the big interesting finding here is the 15 scenes dimensions as measured here at the neighborhood level using yellow page data, such as the number of arts galleries or the number of arts galleries, the number of churches, the number of bookstores. We then code and we generate these 15 types like neighborly, rationalist, self-expressive, and so forth. And the point is in 1996, these scenes dimensions were almost unrelated to voting. If you're a Republican or a Democrat, or if you in a county where you had more of these Republicans or more Democrats, it didn't make any difference in terms of these lifestyle amenity measures. However, almost every year in every election, these things are getting to be more and more differentiating factors, that if people live in a Wicker Park, they're increasingly voting differently than if they live in Lincoln Park, etc. Okay, so that's a big factor, that the scenes, the arts are rising, and so are these separate dimensions of lifestyle. in terms of their politicization. This is showing politicization and voting ideological cleavages. So people talk about America's now divided into two parts. We've got the Democrats and the Republicans, and they're more politicized and fighting each other. We have blue states and red states and so forth. That's the rhetoric you now hear, which you did not hear in 1996.
Professor Emma asked a question. I think it ties in what you are discussing right now. Her question is how social buzz ties into this discussion.
Okay, that's what I want to get to now.
Yeah,
So yes, critical point, and we're almost there. Let me stop here. These are, as we're for reasons of time. If Brandon, are you there and available?
Yes, I'm here.
I sent you an email and asked if you could just say maybe 2 minutes worth on personalism, if you want, as an issue, and second, the alienation idea that we saw with Brecht, and bringing in the anti-alienation as an aesthetic alternative to Brecht from Aristotle's sayings.
Yeah, I was. Did you get the thing I sent about Doris Salcedo? I was like thinking about like that as being like a case that could fit in with some of that, or I can, well, with the like protest public art urban space stuff, but I can also talk about.
No, that's good, but that's a different point.
Okay. Yeah, it's like I just kind of going back to our discussion of like Brecht and stuff earlier, and it's like I feel like there's this this sense kind of like for people who are used to like traditional theater that it looks kind of like just like weird or like bad or something, and so it's like we have, I don't know if any of you have taken media aesthetics or have otherwise come across like the Poetics by Aristotle, which is kind of like the foundational like attempt to theorize like theater and stuff in the West. And in there, Aristotle makes these arguments about the way that the audience is supposed to like ideally identify or sympathize with the characters on stage, and then through he's mostly concerned with tragedy, so it's like by identifying with the characters and watching them go through their trials and tribulations that we achieve like catharsis, which is this like kind of emptying out that's like enjoyable, and we get to like experience these like unpleasant emotions in kind of this like safer environment. And Brecht is kind of like doing the opposite of this, where it's like it's like, so if we have like you know, coming off of like Marx and stuff, if we have like a situation in which people are alienated, it's like to get them to feel, you know, invested in, you know, what's happening on stage could maybe be perceived as like a way of just like deepening that alienation. So Brecht's kind of solution to that is like, we'll just create these like very stylized kinds of plays where people like won't get like invested in the character in this classical way. And it's really interesting if you read his writings. Like he talks about, like, he doesn't like the word actor. He calls the like people who are doing stuff on stage demonstrators, like they're demonstrating something. And he has this whole like this like didactic function of the theater that is very different from the sort of like a personal investment or something that is happening with Aristotle. So I just kind of wanted to draw that out.
Okay, now that's great. And in a sense, the linkage I'm trying to make here is to suggest that if you're normally in a family with your parents, if you're starting to act like a Brechtian actor, it's because you're alienated. And part of this may lead to, or may illustrate, bohemia. That is, one definition of bohemia is that you're fighting with your parents. And so an alienation classically can begin within the family. I mean, if your mother beats you over the head and treats you as a little boy differently from the little daughter, and the little daughter goes to the Baptist church with the mother, and the little boy gets kicked out of the family, and he then looks around in the street, and he may join a gang, or he may be lonely. This is a classic description of Orlando Patterson, one of the leading Black sociologists in the country, of the difference, the gender difference between lower status African American boys and girls, which he points to as a major source of the social problems we have in the U.S. Okay, so and it's not unique to African Americans or the U.S. I mean, little kids got beaten up all the time all around the world, and so the alienation may begin that way if there are institutions which can enhance it, and that's what Brecht is trying to do, moving toward a Marxist revolution through his theater.
It also doesn't like need to be that extreme. Like we can think about like just parents in general or the family as a way that like cultural values are getting passed down in like ways that, and it could be that there's like an alienation that is just like built into that process, because like if the values that are being passed down are, you know, like have some kind of like root in this like alienated, you know, experience, whatever.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so what we're doing in this discussion is trying to join the aesthetics and types of art and how they match with different political systems, economic systems, and how their impacts may shift. And then what theories and what data do we have which bear on this? And for reasons of time, I've got a lot of notes. And
Santiago, you have a question related to alienation or topics before?
No. Okay.
Just have a hand raised. Yeah.
Any other hand up? Okay. One simple point I want to make is just briefly is about buzz at this point. Buzz is something that is a term we've started using, Dan and I, in the arts context, as especially something that the arts can add to the political system. And we have case studies of Chicago and Toronto, and we contrast the two cities because Chicago is a strong party system. In that sense, it's closer to China. It's closer to traditional, more hierarchical, strong party systems. And artists have classically not been active through civic associations. Arts organizations are weak and not very visible in Chicago, contrasted with, that is compared to Toronto. In Toronto, when we saw those videos of Mayor Ford winning in Toronto, he ran by campaigning against the artists and the bicyclists. And he didn't use I don't know, at least in the video, he didn't use the term yuppie, young urban professional, but basically he did talk explicitly about artists and bicyclists, and these were the people who he was running against. The prior mayor who he was running against had become a champion of the arts and of using the arts, and he did this as described in the Scenescapes book and briefly in the other book, Kentuckville Karaoke, and Dan Silver's active discussion, because he worked with a lot of these artists and worked with people in the planning department of the city government, and they had a big impact and in a very Tocquevillian manner, even though this is Canada. By contrast, Chicago is not a typical American city in that respect. It's the opposite of Tocqueville compared to the Toronto case. So he has examples then of how the social media, how posters, how the whole political discussion was transformed by adding aesthetic, smart, pretty pictures or ironic, teasing kinds of slogans, which heightened the excitement and the participation and the success of the artists winning politically, and the developer who wanted to put up a new building led to a protest by the artists. Even though she called it, an art building, the artist said, this is new, we don't want it, and she lost. Okay, so basically, that's a case study there, which illustrates the workings of buzz. And I'll make the more general point, linking this to classical economic theory, to just talk about the idea of inflation or deflation. You can have money circulating in an economic system, and if you have more money in going into it, such as is happening when the central banks are worried about the coronavirus, they're worried we've got a lot of, the market is going, the prices are going down of individual stocks, but the whole economy is going down as there are millions of people unemployed. The whole economy is getting smaller and is getting less active. And analogously, you can think of political power, and this is illustrated mostly as a book by Talcott Parsons on this, is analogous to the political system. And if you think of power as a circulatory medium, and it's not as if it's me versus you, it's the whole political system can have more, if there's more confidence and trust in the political system, the political leaders in the whole political system can do more. That's the Parsonian idea about power. We then take that and build on it further, and in discussing buzz, and say that in Toronto, the artists got more arts responsive policies because they had built up arts buzz, and they had the mayor was convinced enough so that someone was able to run for mayor, and because we have low turnout in general in most these kinds of elections, less than half the people vote, probably different people turned out, and we had an interesting, okay, so we had Ford elected. All right, I'll stop there for a bit and see if there's anything else that Brandon wants to add, based mostly on my notes. That is, I've got 15 pages of notes here and I don't have time to present them all, but I'll turn to Brandon if there's anything you saw in those more general notes, messy and preliminary, but dealing with issues of how do these findings that are the core of the Kentuckville Karaoke book, how might these change if instead of doing what we did with Seoko Kim, that is of dropping the neighbors and friends, and maybe, I'm not sure if family was an item, but if we instead looked at those separately and then contrasted some of these dynamics with trust in the police and so forth, how might some of these factors change, and what are the theories or the hypotheses that we might think about if we brought in personalism more explicitly? I mean, this is important not just for Brandon. That is, this is important for all of us trying to ask why and how is Asia different, and in the sense that Tocqueville doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of the degree of personalism in part, and so it's not uniquely Asian. It's studying the personalism as part of that dynamic, but separating it out and contrasting it with the more impersonal institutions like the national government. Any quick thoughts on any of this, Brandon, or is it too hard in this context to deal with it?
I feel like you might be able to anticipate what I'm gonna say, but it's like I feel like race and ethnicity have like major roles to play in this. So it's like it seems like there could be like an argument made that it's like you have maybe like higher degrees of like individuation or something in like racially heterogeneous societies, whereas like in like more racially homogeneous societies, there's less of that. And it's like because it's like this, and I think that there's something to be thought about in like alienation in there, and it's like you think about like, I don't know, like France and all the problems that France has had with like people have like the groups that have come from like North Africa and like others who are living in these suburbs around Paris. And the fact that it's like, you look at, you know, the people who are, you know, running the government on TV, all of this stuff in France are like not, you know, like those kinds of people. And then it's like, you have these sorts of, you know, like protests and stuff that happen against the state because these marginalized groups feel like they're not being represented in, you know, like in culture, in politics, in these sorts of things. And yeah, so that's kind of like the first thing that starts going off in my mind.
Yep, no, for sure. I mean, clear and strong, and no doubt that's critical to include. But we can separate that from the sort of the personalism component.
Yeah, but like, is personalism like a response to that in some way?
Maybe, yeah, and that it could be. But there,
an empirical question, as sociologists would say. But.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at simple things like, I mean, how much does personalism go back historically? And this is Max Weber in a sense, that the personalism was found in the more Catholic Southern European countries and not in the Northern, less so in the Northern European countries. So Protestantism clearly heightens the conception that the individual person had a direct link to God because you read the Bible yourself individually, whereas in the Catholic context, you'd go to the priest and you'd confess, and the confession thus and the entree to heaven was through the church and through personal relation. I mean, that's the classic Catholic Protestant kind of argument.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a little bit of a tangent, but is also like relevant to our current moment. But I was like watching this thing about the Black Death the other day, and it's like going through a lot of the records that were being kept, and it's like there was just this kind of like resignedness that you see like in a lot of people who become infected, that they get, stuff is pretty brutal. They get like nailed into their houses, and they're basically like, okay, like I'm dying here with like my family, and there's just this kind of like this like accepting that fate. And it's like, you could not imagine that happening, you know, in our present moment, I don't think, especially like definitely in a place like the US. It's like, you have people who, you know, are not being allowed to go to businesses and are like, you know, protesting in the streets as a result of that. So yeah, and then it's thinking about that in Protestantism and Weber and like the Reformation, Black Death happening before that. It's like, it's really difficult to like, it's very difficult, simultaneously difficult and tempting to kind of like think about how those arrows are going, for me at least.
No, 100% agreement. I mean, we have nothing in the U.S. comparable to the Southern European and Asian, you know, strong enforcement that if you want to go to the grocery store, you've got to email a government official, you get an ID number, and only then will the police let you go out. I mean, that's do that in America? You know, so. I
mean, even little things, like if I'm in Germany and I move to like a new house, like the first thing I do is I go to like the post office or whatever, and I register my, you know, thing with, it's like Germany, it's like the German state knows where all their citizens are like all the time. It's like the US, like no one knows that. And you're seeing sort of the chaos with the stimulus check stuff that, you know, it's like, well, you do it through your like taxes, but not everyone, you know, pay their taxes. And it's like and the result of that is all these people, like veterans, retired people who really need that. I'm sorry, I'm being polemical, but
no, but I mean, it's right on. But the point is, and this point is excellent for right now with the coronavirus, but the US is a huge exception, and the rest of the world is more close to having a more hierarchical state, more IDs that are used actively, and which are probably a benefit in helping those governments solve the coronavirus, at least controlling it better than in the more strongly individualistic U.S. with its traditions in this sense. Okay, we're low on time. With more time, I'd love to have more discussion of North Korea. We only had a little bit, but and we've also got Jane Jacobs. I guess what I'm suggesting is at least to have available. What if we post on Canvas so that you all know we have available, and we'll ask if we could, maybe Jim can put a little bit more up about North Korea. And we've got a fascinating book, which I've looked at bits of, where Clifford Geertz is used as talking about the theatrical state, and that many political leaders are illustrated. This does not mean it. So Geertz wrote about Bali, traditional Bali, and a fantastic, huge celebration of a funeral in the 19th century. But the point is, the big point is, and the point by two South Korean experts are writing the book about North Korea, and they basically are saying there's a lot of legitimacy which is generated by these events in North Korea. And the question that raises for me is, one is, how do we measure legitimacy, and how can we know? But second, maybe they're right, and maybe there's a lot more legitimacy in authoritarian political systems than the Western press likes to tell us about. So if we think of it, say the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, there was lots of, they did some pretty good surveys before and then right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, showing a lot of the citizens in East Germany felt the regime was legitimate. And then they're now part of the same integrated Germany, and they vote differently. They're more egalitarian. They want a more active government. They want more leftist policies than do most of the West Germans. So in that sense, there may have been a lot more legitimacy than the Western press would like to have told us about in maybe Putin's Russia, or within China today, or within Stalin's Russia, etc. So I'm posing this simply as a fascinating issue, also saying that the arts may play a role where they may substitute for elections. And North Korea is basically doing this, of having the pageantry of massive parades and artistic demonstrations and the like, and maybe these do build legitimacy. And Latin America, or there's a book on trust by an international expert. He basically argues that places that have more military dictatorships, and he has data for maybe 50 countries, those places with more traditions of military dictatorships have less trust 50 and 100 years later. Okay, so looking at these kinds of things over time makes it more complicated, but I'm simply, my examples of what we have today are basically saying Tocqueville is not universal, that the Tocquevillian argument may work in Northern Europe and the US, but it should not be generalized to the rest of the world, and we ought to look more closely at other alternatives, including especially the arts. Okay, that's the quick overview. And then I guess just to link with the Bohemia kinds of ideas from Hee-Sun Jong, her thesis and other material with her is online. What she's done is sort of take the quick quotes we had from Goth Girl and Baudelaire, and not to talk about that kind of strong, visible Bohemia, but instead to take people who are simply riding their bicycles, recycling. When they go to Starbucks, they bring their own mug because they don't want to have the forest torn down. That is, these things are a generalization from issues that were championed by artists in the counterculture in a more bohemian style 20, 30 years ago, which are changing the ways that we do what we do now. So so she shows more divvy rental bicycle use, more people walking to work, taking public transportation and less use of cars, of individualized car use, works in conjunction with these broadly defined bohemian and artistic things like making more active and visible by having concerts, by posters, by shops inside and adjacent to subway entrances, as is done in Seoul, in the city of Seoul, Korea. By contrast, in Chicago, subway in America in general, subways are dangerous. They're scary. A lot of people say, you know, don't take the L, you'll get beaten up and so forth. That's an image which may be exaggerated, but what can be done? And one answer is have more people there, have more people coming to concerts and have the entrances and the exits of the subways be cool places to be on a Saturday night because there's a concert going on or there's an art show. So this is done in Seoul. Paris is in between. Paris is better than the US, but it's not as good as Seoul in this regard. So these are examples of how the arts can transform legitimacy and specific policies that vary by neighborhood because of placemaking. So they fit with the general course. And what I've tried to do here is link the many individual examples that we're getting with a handful of more general propositions and theories to see if we can at least see where and how they may work based on the limited evidence or partially analyzed data that we have now, making the point that this is a new field, this is work in progress, but we've got a lot of background ideas and a lot of examples to explore. Okay, we're near the end, but any quick comments, questions from anybody else, at least for us to think about? Next week is the exam. We'll have a review session on Monday, exam on Wednesday, in the syllabus. Anything's yeah, and we can stay on with office hours right after this session if you want to stay on and have questions about you individually. But anything more general about the points I've made or others? Yes, the exam is during class time. Is that I can't. I see that that's a written note from Alexander. Is that I can't see beyond the first line of the question. If that's the only question, that's the answer.
Unless you're making arrangements with us.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. It's stated in the syllabus. Although the specific arrangements are with the TAs. The TAs are making arrangements for some people for special times.
Also, if you have like disability, extra time stuff, you should be in contact with us also.
Yeah, that's what I said at the beginning. No multiple choices. As Brandon, or no, as I guess Alan said at the beginning, we have IDs and essay, no multiple choices.
When shall we submit the abstract of our final paper?
Yeah, the suggestion is that we just keep going back and forth. I mean, we had a good discussion with you a week or so ago, and I've got if you could send me another. I just need to get your email. I found a new paper in Chinatown. We'll send it to you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. That is, people doing papers or having ideas along this line, you know, we can keep emailing more openly. There only a handful of people are doing papers. Almost all of you are just taking the exams, and that's fine. So we don't want to have too much general discussion of papers with everybody here. Okay. But stay on if you want. We can talk about any progress or problems on your paper in 5 minutes from now.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Anybody else have any more general questions or comments on what we got? We covered some things a little bit rapidly, but trying at least to link you to sources which can go further where you see fit. And then that is the session, just to reiterate, that the session on Monday, we will review everything. So it's a time again to try to synthesize and integrate the theories, the data, the examples, the evidence. And if we don't have any questions, we can bring in some individual cases that we didn't have time to feature here, like North Korea or the Summer Palace in in Beijing, or continuing work in China, Jane Jacobs. All of these are excellent, interesting cases of what we did talk about today. And you see, I think, how they generally connect, but they're elaborations of work in progress. Okay, we should formally stop. We're over time, but let's stay on for office hours with anybody who wants to talk. Thank you, folks. So yeah, we can maybe stop the recording of the full class.